Hi folks, Steve here, and let's talk through Throne of Blood. I'm just going to start by reading you a quote. If we know the works in question, we become a knowing audience, and part of what theory calls our horizon of expectation involves that adapted text. And that's really what I want to talk about with this film, Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, which is his adaptation of Macbeth. And I'm really interested in this whole idea of the knowing audience when we watch something that we know it's an adaptation, and how do we actually know it's an adaptation, and this sort of horizon of expectation, which means if we know something's an adaptation, we expect particular things of the work, we demand particular things of the work. And I'm really interested in that with this version of Macbeth, in what Kurosawa is doing with it, and the way that he's actually trying to make it a work of Kurosawa cinema, which is, so if we're looking at Leech's modes, putting his own fingerprints all over it. The fact that it's not called Macbeth, I think, is very telling. The fact that it's called not just Throne of Blood, but Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, again, is very interesting. And I wanted to put a film in the course which which was not from sort of the West, but also a film that I was hoping that nobody in the course had seen, because I really want this to really question this whole idea of the knowing audience, and the fact that I'm not asking you to watch a film that you don't know, a film from Japan that you don't know, and how you're going to interpret that film through the parameters of adaptation, and if you are actually going to watch it through the parameters of adaptation. Okay, so the knowing audience, the horizon of expectation. So what happens to an audience when we don't know? What happens? And this sort of this idea, this film, this all the questions I'm asking is really about you as an audience, someone who's interpreting something as adaptation. Now, the interesting thing about Throne of Blood is in 1957, when it was made, Japanese audiences were not that familiar with Shakespeare, not like they are today, right? And therefore, Kurosawa had great freedom to do whatever he wanted to the text, because the Japanese audiences were not going to be watching the film and assessing the film through how faithful he remained to Macbeth. So when you're watching the film, if you're not liking the film, think about it as Macbeth and what he's doing with Macbeth, and whether that actually goes against your whole idea of what Shakespeare should be doing on the screen in a translation of it. Now, unlike, say, Romeo plus Juliet, where a lot was changed, but the language wasn't, Shakespeare's language remained front and centre in the film. With this film, firstly, you don't have Shakespeare's language at all. It's completely erased. And again, another problem is adaptation as translation, right? So you've got a mediator, and with foreign films, you have a mediator. You actually have someone sitting down and saying, well, that's kind of what they said, so I'll write that down. And then with translation, you actually have the problem of you're only limited to write so many words on the screen. So I think that's really interesting as well. With the Criterion Collection edition of this film, which I'll be playing you, there's actually two different translations of the film. I'm going to be playing you the Donald Ritchie translation, because he's more interested in a Western translation of the film. But again, that's something to consider when you're watching the film. How do we watch this film differently, right, today in the West, and think of how you would have watched it in Japan, and how different that changes our whole opinion of the film and also of Shakespeare. Now, as I said, knowing audiences have expectations, they have demands, and by watching this, is your experience enriched? Are you getting a deeper understanding of Shakespeare than before you watched it? is the idea of watching Macbeth in Japan with Japanese language, with Japanese actors, is that actually giving you a deeper, more almost respectful idea of Shakespeare and what he's doing? Is there something more universal going on in this film that gives you a deeper appreciation of the film? And then when you go back to the source text, and this is the real issue here, when you go back to the source text, do you have a deeper understanding of the source text through a film like this? Now, here is a quote from John Ellis. If the adapted work is a canonical one, we may not actually have a direct experience of it, but may rely on a generally circulated cultural memory. And this comes back to the thing about adaptation, which we really need to start talking about, is that adaptation is often about memory, how you remember something, right? It might be something you have just read, but it's how you remember it, right? Most of us don't have the source text in our hand when the film is playing. So think about that. Have you ever sat down and read Macbeth? I'm interested in using Macbeth as a teaching text because a lot of us didn't study Macbeth in high school. And we know Macbeth, we know the story very well because of all the films and plays and all of that. But we haven't actually sat down and studied it like we have something like maybe King Lear, certainly Romeo and Juliet. So I'm interested in the whole idea of Macbeth and how you interpret this film as an adaptation of Macbeth when clearly we're working on cultural memory. Palimpsest is this whole idea of um, a work being altered but bearing visible traces. So what you've got in this film is the idea of it's sort of Macbeth, but it's not really Macbeth. Because what Kurosawa is really interested in doing is making this a Kurosawa film. And if you know about Kurosawa, you will know that he is the guy that directed The Seven Samurais, Yojimbo, a number of hugely successful Japanese films that were taken up by people like Scorsese and Lucas and certainly Spielberg. George Lucas was a huge Kurosawa fan. And Kurosawa, himself was very interested in Shakespeare. Of course, he adapted King Lear into his very famous film, more famous than this, his famous film Ran. And time permitting, of course, I would have loved to have played you Ran because I think it's a beautifully looking film. But this is great in its own way. So the question about this film is, okay, it's Macbeth, but it's not really Macbeth, but is it Shakespeare? And I would actually say that there's a lot of nods to Shakespeare. Like if you look at the film starts and there's huge rain, like really vicious rain, which is very Shakespeare. You remember Shakespeare, Scotland, Macbeth. So the film is sort of true to that. You have a lot of mist, fog, animalistic sounds, which is, again, really interesting. The film is very theatrical, right? A lot of the film takes place on the soundstage, and that actually goes against Kurosawa's realistic style. Kurosawa was known, something like The Seven Samurais and Yojimbo, for being very outdoory, a lot of horses. I mean, he loved the Western. Those things are there, but it's more contained. It's more uh, a, a work that plays out on sound stages, and it looks very theatrical in a number of ways. It's a very cinematic film, but it's very theatrical. And what Kurosawa is doing with this and doing with Shakespeare is he's applying the no tradition, the Japanese no tradition, to Shakespeare. So what you'll see in the clip I'm about to play you, the thing about the no tradition is actors often wore masks. Now, you don't see them wearing masks here, but if you look at Lady Macbeth, she shows very little emotion on her face. And that's the thing about the no tradition, and something that she really embodies more so than anyone else in this in the clip I'm about to show, and also the film. Something else about the no tradition is it's usually two actors on the stage at one time. All right, so if one actor goes, another comes. So there's just two, and often across this film, you will just have two actors talking. And I think that's something to be aware of when you're watching the film. that of what Kurosawa is trying to embody and what trying to channel when he's doing this film. Also, the acting is very theatrical. It's very histrionic. It's very over the top, and again, that's really important in sort of appreciating and understanding what's going on. Okay, so I'll just play the clip. Um, this is the death scene, the Macbeth's death scene, and you can sort of see the characters here on, which actually looks like a theatre stage. And there's Lady Macbeth, who's actually she's a lot colder than Macbeth in or from the play, or how generally she's played out. She's a lot more controlling here. You will find that the Macbeth character, he's a lot weaker and he has to be talked into everything. And Macbeth really plays that role. The thing about Shakespeare's Macbeth is that they both are thinking the same thing. It's just Lady Macbeth is voicing those things. In this film, she's the one with the ambition, and because of that, she seems nastier and tougher. But I'm not so sure whether that's that's entirely true or entirely fair. I just think it's because she sort of plays particular emotions that Macbeth doesn't, that she has to wear more of those meaner and nastier themes. So you've got the camera panning across to her, being very, very evil and very quiet in her movements, and that again is something about the no tradition of what you're actually seeing here. And there he is turning, and there's something very Japanese about this, the setup of this, the way that the camera is not at eye level with him, but it's down at a particular level. So it's not just looking completely down on him, and just look at his movements here. Now, I think this is an interesting moment in the film where Lady Macbeth doesn't just talk him into it, she gives him his weapon, for which he will, enact a murder. And the way that she just hands it to him, and I think it's interesting the way that no dialogue is spoken here. But what's really interesting about this sequence is the fact that, and there you've got a shot, you can't hear it here, but it's the sound of a crow, and crows are often an ominous animal, but in Japanese culture, they are a sign of death. And there you go, that is the only close-up of the film right there, when he's coming to the decision of the murder. Now, instead of typical Macbeth, where you would go and follow Macbeth to the murder, here the attention and the point of view stays on Lady Macbeth as the camera zooms into her. And that's another characteristic of the no tradition, where the gory stuff and the violent stuff often happens off screen. Now, of course, Kurosawa will break this rule in the final sequence, which is one of the goriest and most blood-wrenching sequences Kurosawa put to film, which is, let's just say there's a lot of spears being thrown in the final sequence. And the fact that you stay with Lady Macbeth here, and the fact that she shows no emotion, which has been picked up by a lot of Western critics as her being very cold and very nasty and sort of emotionless. But I would actually say that it's more to do with the no tradition, and often masks are being worn in that. Okay, let's move on from here. So just a final thought. I'm interested in what is not an adaptation. Like, what wouldn't we classify as an adaptation? And I'd be fascinated to know if people watching this say, well, it's not really Macbeth. It's not really an adaptation at all. And why isn't it an adaptation? And how loose can you be with an actual story? Because here, all Kurosawa is really doing is he's adapting the story in a very rough way. You know, a lot of characters aren't even here. The Macduff character is completely written out of this narrative. So there's no revenge for Macduff as there is in the actual play. Now, adaptation, when we're talking about what isn't an adaptation, adaptation comes down to the audience, whether we accept and read something as adaptation. If we accept this as an adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth, then it's adaptation. But if somebody else represents it or interprets it as something else, then it's not adaptation. So it is very much about the person and the viewer and the audience and their emotional response or intellectual response to the work. Does this film give us an alternative to Shakespeare? And I would like you to think about this in comparison to something like Romeo plus Juliet, where both changed locations and genres, right? But how important is Shakespeare and language to Shakespeare? Now, in Romeo plus Juliet, it's like you can change the location, you can update it, you can put Leo DiCaprio, Claire Danes, you can do all of that, but don't change Shakespeare's language. In this film, it does all of that. I mean, it doesn't cast Leo DiCaprio, obviously, but it, new popular actors and different location and different period and all of that. It does all of that, but it also changes the language. So therefore, I'm going to leave you with this question: how important is the language of the source to something as adaptation? Right? Do you actually have to use the language from the source for it to be termed as adaptation? And if the answer is no, then that may ask us to re-question actually what's going on in Romeo and Juliet, and why Baz was so determined not to change the dialogue there. Okay, I'll leave it there. I think this is going to be a fascinating film to work through. There's so much in there, just through the Japanese culture and translation as adaptation and interpretation as adaptation. It's a really great film. It's got some amazing sequences in it, and the final sequence is a real hoot. Looking forward to it. See you soon.